Hello, and welcome to episode 5 of Planet and the People, the podcast that explores the different facets of climate change and how we protect our planet. So, I have decided to introduce this episode once again, sat up a tree. I did so last week, and actually it's incredibly comfortable, so I thought I'd just come back. So, for this episode, I had a chat with Chiara Vitali from the campaigning organisation Greenpeace. We spoke about Greenpeace and the work they do. We also talked about climate change in general. But we focused primarily on forestry and the reasons behind deforestation. Chiara is a forestry campaigner at Greenpeace. So, before I pass you over, one of the names that came up quite a few times without actually clarifying who it was Bolsonaro. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the name, Bolsonaro is the Brazilian president, just to give you a little bit of context when that conversation comes up. So, without further ado, I will pass you over to my past self and Chiara Vitali from Greenpeace. Hi, Chiara.
Hi Tom, how are you doing?
Good, thank you. How are you coping with the lockdown?
Well, I guess it's same for everybody. It's a bit up and down, isn't it? You have some days where you think like, oh, this is fine, I can do this for weeks, no problem. And then some days you're just like, oh my God, let me out of this house.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah,
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for talking to me today.
no problem.
You work for Greenpeace. So, can you tell me a little bit about Greenpeace? What is Greenpeace, if nobody's ever heard of them?
No problem. So, Greenpeace is a global environmental campaigning organization. It has quite an interesting history with roots in sort of Quaker philosophy of the 1970s now, and the kind of the ethos of Greenpeace, which is based on kind of non-violent direct action and sort of bearing witness to environmental crime, actually started with nuclear testing off the coast of North America,
Oh, right.
in the 1970s, and a sort of small group of people decided that they were going to kind of put themselves on the line and put their bodies and their lives on the line to stop these nuclear tests being carried out. And that was kind of the first sort of form of direct action as Greenpeace carries it out.
Is that nuclear testing for bombs when they were developing nuclear bombs?
Yeah.
Oh, right. I didn't know that.
Yeah, so really interesting, and that was kind of the start of that. And I'm not sure I've got the details entirely clear in my head of kind of the sequence, but then kind of at some point it was on to kind of whaling and the same kind of principle of people sort of putting themselves on the line to again stop harm being done, and it's kind of evolved from there, and it's moved from this kind of small act of intervention in Canada to being worldwide. It's now headquartered in the Netherlands. It's moved over from Canada, and but it continues to use the same philosophy. There's a bit more of an element of kind of investigation now. We have quite a strong kind of investigative element of uncovering environmental crime wherever it's happening, documenting, exposing, but then kind of again that sort of that direct action thread and that kind of intervening and campaigning against and sort of using the power of a public movement to stop environmental harm is still very much there.
I suppose moving on from that, tell me a little bit about yourself and your involvement with Greenpeace.
I've been working at Greenpeace for just over a year now. And I think what attracted me to this role is that it sits in a field that I'm very interested in anyway. So I'm a forest campaigner, so I work on kind of the role that the UK has in driving, or could have in preventing deforestation worldwide. So the impact that we have on the world's forests. And I think what really struck me about this role is that it sits at the intersection of things that I'm very passionate about. So biodiversity and conservation and fighting climate change, but also animal welfare, because the very intimate connection between deforestation and meat production in our food system means that it actually kind of there's a very close drive between the growth of factory farming and driving deforestation at a global level, which can go into in a bit more detail in a sec.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So I suppose that leads on to my next question, which is, what is climate change? In the view of Greenpeace, what are the biggest risk factors of climate change in the view of Greenpeace?
So there's obviously it's the $1 million question, and I think everyone's view on this kind of evolves over time. But there are a few kind of major principles to tackle climate change. One of them is fossil fuels. We need to stop burning fossil fuels, the ones that are in the ground. We need to leave in the ground, and we need to be weaning ourselves off of that. But kind of complementary to that is the fact that our planet has its own kind of checks and balances and almost kind of protections against sort of devastating environmental change of the sort that climate change is. That's kind of natural landscapes and forests in particular, but also oceans. So complementary to changing the way we act and sort of leaving fossil fuels in the ground and changing this kind of destructive, extractive economy is also allowing nature to recover, restore. So ending deforestation, allowing ocean recovery, and allowing these, they're called carbon sinks. Basically, they are features of the natural world that can draw carbon out of the air and store it. So when you're looking at deforestation, not only is a forest being chopped down and carbon is being released in that act, carbon that's in the trees, carbon that's in the soil, often fire is involved. That's one of the main tools of deforestation in many regions. But you're also looking at all the kind of carbon storage potential of that landscape being wiped out in that process. So there's really these sort of complementary elements. Stop releasing carbon and allow our planet to fulfill its carbon absorption potential.
Yeah. Stop emitting carbon and allowing our planet to suck carbon in,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah.
So, again, I've talked to a few different people about what climate change is as a whole. I've talked to a climatologist and I've talked to various different representatives of different organisations. But if someone's listening to this episode for the first time, a real basic overview. What is carbon dioxide? What are greenhouse gases?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So carbon dioxide is one of the greenhouse gases, and greenhouse gases are sort of chemical compounds that going into the atmosphere sort of cause it to absorb and retain more of the heat from the sun's rays than it would otherwise. The metaphor I've kind of heard is like they're kind of like wrapping the earth in a blanket, which means that heat that comes in then can't get back out again, because our climate is a very complex and quite kind of delicate balance of factors and systems. That kind of change can have really massive real life consequences.
Yeah, that's well put. The blanket effect.
Yeah.
And I suppose a quick question for you personally is, why choose an organisation like Greenpeace in this fight against climate change, to join the fight against climate change? What is unique about Greenpeace's approach?
So for me, it very much comes down to this systems approach. I think it's really important to focus our efforts not on the kind of low-hanging fruit and the easy wins, but on what's really going to create lasting change and kind of catalyze system change and sustainable change. So for Greenpeace, and particularly for our forests work, for me, it's the focus on consumption that's really important. So you could do loads of work on trying to make the way we produce food, which is a main driver of deforestation, more sustainable through kind of tweaks and what we call incremental changes. But when you're looking at a world where the, say, consumption of meat has increased fourfold over the past 50 years and is looking at, and again, an increase by 3/4 by 2050, we eat twice as much meat as the global average. In this case, we really need to be looking fundamentally at diet change, and particularly a change in the Western diet. And all of this meat, I think people kind of know about beef and deforestation, but what's less known is that all kinds of meat, and particularly the factory farmed, intensively farmed meats, are actually highly dependent on crops like soya, but other crops come into the mix as well, that are grown at the frontier of deforestation.
Can I ask? You said that the global intake of meat has increased fourfold. Did you say in the last 50 years? Is that in proportion with the population growth, or is that just global habits have increased?
Um, well, I'm not a population expert, but roughly the world's population has about doubled over that time. So if you're kind of doing the maths, meat consumption has per person has doubled on top of that population growth. You might want to double check those figures, because again, I'm not a kind of population expert, but that's roughly the scale. So although population is growing, the real issue is that actually per person, our consumption habits have ballooned so much that each person is having a massively disproportionate impact. And when you're looking at that, and you're looking at the fact that actually a lot of that impact will be people like us in the developed world, having an even more disproportionate impact than someone who is in a developing country, then you really see that actually we really need to get our own kind of habits and patterns under control before we can talk about, population as a whole.
That's really interesting because I think it feels like in the recent years people have become more aware and less reliant on meat is needed in every meal, and it feels like that's quite an old-fashioned idea, like meat and two veg with every meal. So that's interesting that actually meat consumption has increased
Hmm.
per individual.
Yeah. So obviously that's a global figure, and it very much depends kind of where you're looking at in the world. I'd say in the UK, over recent years, the pattern's been fairly stable. But what's really interesting here is, I think because people have become kind of more aware and conscious about the environmental impacts of meat consumption, they've tried to make changes, but obviously we're all quite conservative, we're creatures of habit. So in trying to kind of make a change, um, what's happened is people have switched from one kind of meat to the other. So they've switched from red meat to chicken. But ironically, again, every context is different. In the UK, chicken, because it's so dependent on imports of industrial animal feed, has a higher environmental deforestation impact than beef. So really, it's not about swapping one meat for another. It's about reduction, and that we haven't really had. We're about flat, and within that kind of flat curve, we're sort of swapping around when we all need to collectively really be reducing to drive our impact down.
You mentioned about sort of a fundamental element of Greenpeace is pushing for systemic change. Have you noticed any big wins in the sort of in systemic changes that have been brought about?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Greenpeace is kind of one of the most impactful environmental organizations. So that's kind of one of the reasons why, as a kind of campaigner by profession, you would be drawn to the organization. One of the really recent wins we had was when on the Heathrow,
Oh
on
yes,
the Heathrow
yeah.
expansion. Um, which I think kind of covers both bases. It has an immediate kind of impact in terms of the third runway would have been a phenomenal carbon emitter if you accounted for kind of all the new flights that would have been coming into there. But I think it's also when you're looking at that systemic change, you're looking a lot at the symbolic value of wins and changes. So there's something really important and really symbolic there about the recognition of the fact that sometimes kind of new development and sort of the expansion that everyone is pushing for is going to have to be weighed up against its climate impact. And I think it's really deeply symbolic that in this case, the climate impact was deemed to be significant enough that the plans for expansion were kind of blocked by the courts. So it's always kind of looking at that. It's looking at what's your immediate win, what's the immediate impact, but also what does that mean for the wider context? What does that mean in terms of symbolic value, in terms of culture shift, and kind of how can you then take that and amplify it and make it bigger than the immediate event?
Um, let's talk a bit about forests because that is your area
Mm.
as well. 2019 and early 2020 saw some real forest devastations. I mean, Brazil and then Australia, and I mean there was a lot going on with Brazil. And one of the things that I'm kind of interested in exploring and scared of really is how individual countries can do their bit. And some countries are much better than others in terms of fighting climate change, and other countries such as the US, such as Australia, and such as Brazil, are sort of doing the opposite. They're just not really interested at all in fighting it. They're actively deforesting. And Bolsonaro, I mean, the Amazon belongs to Brazil. Leave us alone. It's none of your business. Is kind of his his attitude. I mean, what happened? This is another big question. What happened there?
Um, okay, so first of all, fires are a seasonal thing. That's a reality. They can be a combination of kind of natural events. So, for instance, in Australia, you do kind of have like a lot of natural occurring bushfires. Um, when you're looking at somewhere like the Amazon, it's a tool that is part of kind of the land management there to some extent. Some farmers set fire to plots to kind of clear the land to sort of create ash that kind of falls into the soil as fertilizer. But what we were looking at last year was a massive expansion of the fires, kind of compared to the previous year. Last year was on a different scale, and we do unfortunately have evidence. There were reports in local media that a lot of these fires were being set kind of outside of sort of established areas, outside into kind of areas that should not be deforested, and that they were being set basically on kind of an assumption that there was tacit or sometimes not so tacit support from Bolsonaro, or the fires were being set kind of almost as a sort of act of defiance in support of the president. So there was one particular area where farmers actually kind of launched what they called a day of fire. Again, that was kind of reported in regional media, where there was a coordinated effort to set fires as an act of support for Bolsonaro. And that particular region had a 300% increase that day of fires, of fire hotspots compared to the previous year. And it is kind of, yeah, it's quite well established that Bolsonaro's politics were tied in with the fact that the fires were so massive and so destructive. And unfortunately, we're expecting that this year may be a repeat, maybe even worse, given the fact that a lot of the local environmental enforcement patrols and staff are out of action because of the coronavirus crisis. But evidence we're seeing coming out of the region is that at the same time, illegal loggers and kind of illegal land clearance and mining is not working from home at all.
No.
They are very active, and the safeguards to kind of keep them at bay are weakened. Unfortunately, obviously, we hope that that might not happen, but we're expecting that this year may be as tragic and destructive, if not more.
Oh dear. Oh God.
Yeah, which is a scary thought.
I sort of, it's funny. It's when you see that going on and it's now in the past and Australia's fires are in the past, you think, oh God, that's over. Now it's about kind of getting things back in track and reforesting and sorting that out. But is there anything that individuals or organizations can do to prevent or mitigate that happening?
Well, I think it's really important to note that uh, what's happening in Brazil at the end of the day is a response to global demand and global patterns
Mm.
of consumption, which are fueling demands for crops like soya. We're creating a very profitable and booming market that creates an incentive to deforest, and we're creating this phenomenal demand for this one single crop, and people who are looking to kind of make a better life for themselves sometimes are responding. Big business in Brazil is also very much responding, and I think we have to sort of take responsibility for the fact that this stuff isn't happening in isolation, that the choices we make as countries, as collectives, as societies, but also as individuals have an impact. Our food system is very much global,
Yeah.
and what we do has an impact elsewhere. So we can kind of look at these countries and think it's a tragedy, and it's easy to want to blame Bolsonaro. It's easy to want to blame the people who are kind of at the frontier who are carrying out deforestation. But I think we really need to think about kind of, is our house in order? What's our role? Are we contributing to this in what we're doing? And at the moment, unfortunately, the situation is it's not ideal, it's not what people wanted, but if we are kind of buying factory farmed meat, then we are contributing So we need to get that in order. We need to really think about kind of what we're doing ourselves and the impact we're having, and then we can maybe start looking at kind of trying to reach out to these other countries and try and kind of create a more constructive relationship and ask them to safeguard these landscapes that we really care about and that we depend on. But I think both need to happen at the same time, in order for that to be credible, in order for us to be doing our bit.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about I want to talk a little bit about some of the reports that you've written. I read Winging It. Thank you very much for sending that to me. You've also written something called Under Fire. Tell me a little bit about Under Fire because I'm not familiar with that one.
So Under Fire is essentially a case study on a estate in Brazil in the Matopiba region, which is in the um, in the Cerrado, which is Brazil's kind of wooded savanna. It's a huge expanse of land south of the Amazon. It's one of I think it's the most biodiverse savanna in the world. It's an amazing area of kind of for biodiversity, for conservation. It has a really important role in terms of the water table in Brazil, and kind of lots of rivers that can kind of bring water to other regions are born, as it were, in the Cerrado. So it's this incredible place that kind of goes under the radar because a lot of attention is focused on the Amazon. But essentially, about half of the Cerrado savanna has already been wiped out and turned into soya plantations, again, to sort of supply industrial animal feed. And the report Under Fire basically focuses on one of these estates, one of these kind of huge plantations. It was the kind of episode that precipitated this is that our Brazilian staff were accompanying a German TV crew to visit a community that lives kind of on the land of the Estrondo estate, or near the land of the Estrondo estate, and were met by an armed raid, essentially. That was sent there to essentially intimidate the community in a kind of, probably in the process of some kind of land grabbing effort. But basically, the communities that live in these areas, they just live these lives of kind of they're constantly under threat. They're constantly kind of the subject of intimidation, land grabbing. There's reports of this kind of widespread pesticide use that these huge monocultures are dependent on. Obviously, kind of it's not a precise art. It's a spray from a plane often, and that kind of tends to land on their villages. There's health problems related to that. So Under Fire is basically a study in kind of this particular estate, the impact it's having on the local communities, its horrendous track record of kind of human rights violations, both of sort of local people and of labor, and also the fact that this particular estate has actually been given a new deforestation permit for tens of thousands of acres.
They've been given a permit
Yes,
from
yes.
the
So
government.
permits to continue deforesting are still being released. Um, and they are still being released to kind of all sorts of enterprises. And the alarming thing is that this particular estate is actually trading with some of the world's biggest kind of agribusiness traders, who are then exporting the product of estates like this into the UK. So you've got companies like Cargill. I think they're the biggest private company in the world. They're sort of a global food giant, basically. They trade in everything from kind of soya to sort of corn syrup to chicken meat. They are buying from this estate. They have a silo on the grounds of this estate, so their presence is very clear there. They're bringing product from estates like this into the global market. And then, because of the way the soya market works, it's all just being mixed together. They're not able to provide any guarantee to user or buyer in the UK that the product they're buying isn't from a place like this, where it's contributing to deforestation, to human rights violations, and to violence.
Yeah, because you cover that. You cover that in Winging It as well. Your other report, and about how the supply chains, about how many
Mm-hmm.
supermarkets that you approached, that Greenpeace approached, weren't really able to give you a detailed analysis of their supply chains. as to whether they contributed to deforestation or not. And I suppose, is that why? Because it's all mixed in, and you've got kind of things from it's such a complicated supply chain that some of it's okay, some of it's not.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. It's not that companies haven't been trying to kind of make sense of this system. I don't think any kind of UK company, UK retailer that we surveyed wants to be trading in deforestation. But the reality of the market, because we've got these kind of globally traded products and everything's kind of so obscure and not transparent, is that it's not possible to buy the amount of soy or of animal feed that we're buying at the moment and know that you're not buying products from deforestation or products that are contributing to human rights violations and violence. And our answer at this point is, if it can't be done, then you can't be buying this stuff. The assumption can't be we just keep buying this stuff no matter what. The assumption has to be, if we can't do this safely, then at this point we're in a climate emergency, we're in a biodiversity crisis, and the scale of the human rights violations and the violence that's happening in Brazil is ever more evident. We have to say at some point we draw the line and we don't just keep buying this stuff at any cost. Um, and to stop buying this stuff, to stop being dependent on soya and imported industrial animal feed, we have to change how we consume. We have to be less dependent on industrially produced meat.
Yeah. So talking about winging at your other report, that is largely about chickens and soya. And you mentioned earlier that beef, red meat consumption has gone down,
Mm-hmm.
whereas chicken consumption has gone up. Talk a little bit about winging it and chickens and soya in general.
Well, we wanted to look at chickens specifically because they are the meat that's booming the most in the UK, because this boom is fueled by environmental concerns and by people effectively trying to do the right thing. And we wanted to kind of draw attention to the fact that actually this is the sort of change that can risk having unintended consequences. So the deal with chicken is essentially the fact that we farm it intensively. 95% of the chickens produced in the UK are intensively farmed. So you're looking at a system where they are raised indoors in these kind of huge sheds, essentially, that can contain sort of tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of chickens. Because they're indoors in a shed, food has to be brought to them, and the food that is brought to them tends to be kind of crushed grains, often grains that could actually be used for human consumption. That's part of the irony. To produce a kilo of chicken, the estimate is that we're using about 3.2 kilos of human edible food. So we're actually taking food that could be just used as food, we're turning it into animal feed, we're feeding it to these animals, and we're kind of finding this really inefficient way
Yeah.
to actually feed ourselves, because we want this kind of effectively luxury product. That's what meat is. We've become accustomed to thinking it's a daily thing, and the price has been kind of driven further and further down, but it was a luxury product, and it still is if you consider kind of the full impact and the full cost of it. So when you're looking at this industrial animal feed, it contains all sorts of grains, and one of the kind of important components of it is soya, because it's a very high protein crop. And we're importing that soya from elsewhere because we can't grow it very well in the UK. So every year the UK imports over 3 million tons of soya to feed chickens and other factory farmed animals like pigs, but chickens are kind of the biggest slice of the market. And when we're looking at the fact that soya is often grown in high deforestation risk regions, and it's a market that is kind of impossible to monitor and really untransparent, and even kind of the big players in the market can't get visibility and traceability on where that's coming from, you can see that that's a massive issue.
You talk also about various chicken companies that have committed or are committing to a no deforestation plan. How does that work? If they are being fed soya, if they are being fed all this, how can they commit to such a plan?
So there's various ways that that companies are attempting to do this. One thing that's quite important to note is that this isn't the first time that we've seen no deforestation plans. 2020 was meant to be a massive deadline in the fight against deforestation. Hundreds of companies that are members of the Consumer Goods Forum, including, for instance, Tesco, made a commitment that they were going to cut deforestation out of their supply chains by 2020. It's 2020 now. None of the companies are even near achieving this goal. In fact, in the 10 years since that commitment was made, so between 2010 and 2020, worldwide, an area of forests twice the size of the UK has been cut down. So deforestation is rampant. These companies have completely sailed past the deadline, and we're just not close to solving the problem. So deforestation commitments, they've been out there for a long time. The way that companies have been approaching them have just not worked. So when we're looking at the commitments that companies in the UK have kind of brought on soya and on sort of chicken production, what you're often looking at is there's things like credits that are being brought in, which is it's a little bit like carbon offsetting for soya production. You're still buying the soya that is available on the market. It could have come from anywhere, but you put some money into a project that is combating deforestation, or you're giving money to a sustainable farm somewhere, and you're sort of going, well, that sort of fixes that, and we're okay now. That does not stop deforestation. It just doesn't work that way, sadly. It would be great if it did, but it doesn't. And you're looking at companies trying to get hold of certified soya, which is very difficult at the moment. Only 2% of the soya that's coming into the UK is actually certified.
What is certified soya?
Certified soya is soya that is that has a stamp of approval that it is not contributing to deforestation. Certification schemes have their own problems. They're not foolproof by any means. But even if we could say they're a step in the right direction, the soya that's coming into the UK just isn't even certified. It's not even got that kind of basic level of somebody somewhere being able to say, yeah, this is no deforestation. We're not even there. So in terms of commitments that companies are sort of putting in place, we would really support kind of effective and comprehensive commitments. We just haven't seen anything so far that looks realistic or that looks effective.
You mentioned sort of intensive farming and battery farming. What's the case with free range chickens? Is it a completely different system? Is it far more sustainable?
So the issue kind of when you're looking at free range versus intensive, you kind of have to be looking at what they're fed to look at their environmental impact. So chances are that the free range chickens, free range certification can mean lots of things anyway. When you look at something that says, oh, free range certified, you sort of think, oh, this must be like a nice traditional old school farm where the chickens kind of live in this open barn, peck around in the fields, and it's all wonderful. It can cover all sorts of things, from your kind of family organic farm that's doing things sort of the way you'd imagine, but it can also still cover a huge industrial shed where chickens happen to have access to the outdoors for part of the day or for the whole of the day. So there's a huge spectrum covered by free range, and it doesn't mean that they're not being fed soya and that they're not being fed industrial animal feed. And then when you're looking at kind of the idea of free range, you're looking at, can we produce the volume of meat that we are producing and eating at the moment if we did it all free range? Realistically, it would take up a huge amount of land, and you'd kind of end up creating all sorts of other problems. So again, we're falling back into that category of trying to make little tweaks to the system, but not fundamentally changing the way that we are, the way that we're eating and the way that we're living. And unfortunately, to really take on climate change and to really kind of have a chance in this fight, we do need to be looking at kind of pretty fundamental changes to our consumption, to our patterns of how we live, which, sounds scary and dramatic, but it can be done in ways that are sort of better for us and better for the planet.
Yeah, it's interesting you say about can we feed everyone with free range chickens if the level of consumption stays the same. I've noticed that there's a big impetus on free range eggs. In any supermarket, you go to the elf shelf. The elf. You go to the egg shelf,
Just go to the
and
supermarket, pick up an elf. It's fine.
yeah, you go to the egg shelf, and on the bottom shelf there are eggs from caged hens, and all of the rest of it is free range. So everyone always focuses on let's get free range eggs, but actually chickens, the actual meat, it doesn't really say. It's not so
Yeah.
prevalent. So it's interesting. Obviously, eggs are easier to produce free range than chickens, but it's interesting how people care a lot about where their eggs come from, but don't really care about where their chickens come from.
Yeah, it's surprising, isn't it? We were really surprised kind of when we came across that 95% intensively farmed figure for chicken meat. We were really shocked as well, again, because of all this emphasis on free range eggs. And if you look at companies like Pret sandwiches are all made with free range egg. But the meat is just it's just meat, so it's not guaranteed free range at all, apparently.
That's
Um,
interesting.
yeah,
I mean, it's interesting what you said about it being a luxury item, a luxury commodity, and it is, I suppose. I mean, if you're going to eat meat or dairy or eggs of any sort, it sort of needs to be worth the chicken.
yeah,
It's interesting thinking of it as a value as a luxury item
yeah,
because it seems to be there's often a bit of a war, a bit of a kind of gap between like full vegan or I eat as much meat as I want, and there's
yeah.
nothing kind of in between, and people don't necessarily consider it as something luxury that you can just tread carefully with and treat with respect.
Yeah, yeah. And a lot of it comes down to the fact that we've created these really elaborate systems that hide the hidden cost of food. You know, when you're looking at a system where, I mean, realistic, let's be honest about this. A lot of this is because there's so much pressure kind of on the whole system and on farmers particularly to be producing this stuff kind of cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and it's kind of applying this distortion to our food system where we're finding every kind of trick and system and whatever we can to kind of increase economies of scale to find the cheapest feed. And yeah, it is kind of creating these distortions in the system and this kind of warped perception that actually, yeah, chicken is worth £2 or whatever it is, when yeah, if you were seeing the full cost of the supply chain and the cost of the environmental impacts, it would be so much more.
Yeah. I want to quickly ask. We touched on this briefly, but it seems silly not to talk about COVID-19 in this current climate. And there's lots of talk about the environmental impacts of it. I think people are thinking that basically the world is saved by this environmentally, which I think is a little bit over enthusiastic. What are your thoughts on the impacts?
I think what's really interesting about COVID-19 and this kind of horrible crisis is the fact that it is a huge disruption in the system. It is going to create openings for change. I think you're absolutely right that it's not necessarily, we can't just assume that it's all going to be positive change. For instance, right now, we've got kind of there's massive economic stimulus being thrown into the mix, and there's highly destructive companies like aviation that are sort of calling out for these bailouts and calling out to be kind of supported to then kind of continue to run business as usual. And if that were to happen, it would be a very sad outcome from all of this disruption and from this moment of kind of real shaking up of the system. If it was done right, if the recovery from this crisis is done right, it could actually be a real turning point. It could be a moment of change. If, say, these bailouts weren't being handed out to kind of all of the sort of worst climate offenders, no strings attached, but were being handed out, first of all, in a way that is protecting jobs and protecting the public good. If they're being handed out with a condition that high emitting industries must make a transition to be more climate friendly and climate compatible, then you could be looking at something really significant and really important. Um, when you're looking at the food system as well, kind of this is an unprecedented time of kind of scrutiny of where does our food come from, why were supermarket shelves empty, and are we at risk of that happening again? is our is our food system resilient, or is it kind of vulnerable to shocks? And I think it's really important that we're having these conversations right now, and that we are kind of looking at, where does our food come from? What's the supply chain? It's sort of throwing open some of
Yeah.
these hidden elements that we were talking about. For instance, when you're looking at our industrial meat supply chain, that kind of starts with a chemical plant in Europe producing kind of fertilizers and pesticides, flying them over to Brazil, cultivating these kind of giant monocrop cultures, flying them back over here, sticking them in an industrial farm, taking them over to a processing unit. There's a lot of kind of links there that
Yeah.
can go wrong. And it's just thinking about, how have we set up our system, and are we prepared for times of
Yeah.
crisis? And I think, yeah, if we sort of step up to that challenge and react to this in a sort of constructive way, in a way that makes us more resilient, there could be something positive that comes out of it. Obviously, there's a risk of, you know, the usual interests win out. We carry on with business as usual. Yeah, it's there's a lot hanging in the balance right now.
Yeah. Just quickly want to ask a little bit about sort of projects, campaigns, petitions that are going around that the Greenpeace are generating. Just wanted to ask if there are any projects, campaigns, petitions that you are particularly excited about at the moment.
Well, I think at the moment, it's well worth paying attention to all of the campaigning that's happening around the stimulus and the bailouts, and kind of all the money that's being pumped into the economy right now. It's something really critical that's hanging in the balance now, and any kind of push in the right direction is really helpful. So I would definitely recommend kind of getting on to Greenpeace UK on Facebook, or signing up to our mailing list, because at the moment we have got quite a lot of work going on around that. We've really worked hard to kind of sort of pivot into this crisis really as quickly as we could, and sort of be reactive, because obviously kind of the conversation, the kind of fight for the
Yeah,
handouts is happening right now.
like you were saying, so
So
pushing those handouts in the right direction rather than in the wrong
exactly.
direction. Yeah,
Exactly. I think that's something really important to be paying attention to right now, because a lot of those conversations are happening on the quiet,
yeah,
behind closed doors, and it's really important that there's scrutiny and that they're thrown open, and that the public have their say.
yeah. Well, thank you very much for chatting to me, Chiara.
Yeah, no problem.
I
Pleasure.
suppose one last question, which I've been asking everyone, is how much hope do you feel in terms of the climate crisis and climate breakdown and all the awful things that have been projected? How much hope do you feel about us getting out of this and not reversing, but reversing some of climate change and adapting to it and stopping the climate crisis?
Gosh, that is the $1 million question, isn't it?
I
I think,
mean, you've got to feel a certain element, otherwise you wouldn't bother working.
yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm quite an optimist by nature. So it depends how you define getting out of this. We're not going to get out of this scot-free. We're not going to get out of this with business as usual. And we, sort of, even the word getting out of this involves that somehow there's not going to be any consequences. I think there will be impacts. There will be a need for massive changes, and I think life as we know it, and business as usual won't be able to carry on necessarily. But I like to think that, in the way that we usually do, kind of at the 11th hour, we'll somehow manage to kind of scramble together and pull together some kind of solution to avoid the worst impacts. What I really worry about is that we won't provide for the huge section of the world that is not as fortunate as us, and doesn't have the kind of the slack in the system that we do. We can take some pretty major changes to our lifestyle and we'll still be okay. Not so much if you're a subsistence farmer and suddenly the rain isn't coming for your crops, and you're suddenly running out of food. So that's where I think things really lie in the balance. It's kind of, how are we going to deal with this collectively, and are we going to make sure that the mess that fundamentally we've made as the wealthier section of the world doesn't end up absolutely kind of devastating the global south and developing countries and less affluent societies. I think, yeah, there's a lot hanging in the balance there. I don't think it's clear sort of how that's going to go. But again, I kind of hold on to my sort of nugget of optimism and sort of keep at it. And I'm hopeful. I'd say moderately hopeful.
Do you think there's a chance that those extreme weather events could be reduced and that sort of those expectant rainfalls, those expectant summers, cold patches, etc., could be evened out? Or do you think we are definitely headed for a level of extremity that we can't really go back from?
I think realistically we are headed for extreme weather events and huge kind of changes. We're already seeing them. We're already seeing fire seasons that are kind of beyond what's been seen in recent years, and we're flooding and storms. Um, but I think we do have a huge capacity for adaptation. I don't think we can realistically expect that we're going to kind of get away scot-free from all of that stuff. We're going to have to deal with a lot of the consequences of the change that's already happened. But I think we can find resilience to deal with it. It's just kind of going to be about how do we do it, and do we do it the right way?
And we can get it to a point where it's manageable and stop it from going too far.
I hope so.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Let's
that's
hope
what
so.
that's what you have to hope, isn't
Yeah.
it? And it's hard to say yes, we definitely can, because it's hard to say how we're going to react to it collectively. You know, if we react in all the right ways, then yes, there's still time, but we have to react.
Yeah.
Out of interest, what of the other guests on the past podcast answered to that question?
I think no one's 100% no. In 10 years' time, we're all going to see
Yeah.
massive disasters and flooding and fires, and we're all going to die. So there's no point. No one said that.
Yeah, no, as you say, we wouldn't be in this field realistically if we didn't have some kind of hope, right?
And just go down some hedonistic craze.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for talking to me. That was a really
problem,
fascinating
pleasure.
chat. That was Chiara Vitali from Greenpeace. I did actually answer her question about how much hope the other guests had in a little bit more detail after I'd finished recording, but you're going to have to listen to the other episodes for that. But I will give you a little nugget that Professor Mark Maslin, Professor of Climatology at UCL, did tell me that he was feeling positive and encouraged for the first time in 10 years. So to find out why, have a listen to episode 1. So if you'd like to hear a little bit more about Greenpeace, they are online, greenpeace.org or greenpeace.org.uk. They are also on social media at Greenpeace and at Greenpeace UK or at Greenpeace USA, whichever country you are in. Also, if you would like to read either of Chiara's 2 reports, Winging It and Under Fire, they are on the Greenpeace website, but I have also included the links to them in the description of this episode. So that brings us to the end of another episode of Planet and the People. Thank you very much for tuning in. Next week features the only interview that I have got in this series that was actually conducted in real life with people in a room, sitting in a room. And that is all about hemp, the wonders of hemp and its many opportunities as a climate solution. So until then, to hear more about the podcast and to ask any questions, do follow me on social media at Planet and the People on Facebook and Instagram, and at Planet and the P on Twitter. So have a good week and goodbye for now.